thank you everyone who has taken the time to join us today to discuss the easy, effective way to identify gifted students with behavior rating scales. My name is Sarah Haynes-Dietzen. I'm with Taylor and Francis, Routledge Books. We also publish the Proof Rock Press titles as well. And I'm joined by the editor for that list of books, Rebecca. She's here on the call with us. And then the person that you've all been waiting to hear from is Dr. Gail Ryser. She is with us. She is the lead author, the co-creator of Scales for Identifying Gifted Students 2, or SIGS 2 as we like to call it. And we are just so thrilled that Christopher, thank you Christopher, if you can hear me, for letting us join in on your existing meeting. We do really appreciate your time and allowing us to get on the schedule. So without further ado, I would like to turn it over to Gail, who's going to tell us some more about her gifted assessment tool.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Rebecca, and all of you viewing. I'm looking forward to talking with you about the scales for identifying gifted students, or the SIGS 2. So without further ado, let us begin. So what is the scales for identifying gifted students 2, or the SIGS 2? It is a rating scale. It is a measure of strengths. So that's really a nice feature of it. And it consists of 2 different rating scales, the school rating scales, which educators can complete, and the home rating scale, which parents or guardians could complete. The other really nice feature of the SIGS 2 is it has a paper pencil version and an online version. And the online version is really nice and it's very easy to use. Both of these are great. So what is the SIGS 2? It consists of 7 scales that are 10 items each. You'll see a list of these scales on this slide. As you can see, there are 4 domain-specific scales: language arts, mathematics, science, social studies, and 3 more general scales: general intellectual ability, creativity, and leadership. The ratings are based on a 0 to 4 scale, from 0 being never and 4 being much more. Well, what does that mean? What you're doing as a rater is you're comparing each item. Remember, the items reflect strength. They reflect behaviors that you can observe in either a classroom setting or a home setting in these 7 areas. And you are comparing each of those items to what degree does a student show that this characteristic in comparison with the same grade level peer. And that's very important. We're looking at the same grade level. So let's look at some items and let's talk about how that will be rated. Let's take the language arts item, for example. That's the second one. Remember, there's 10 items per scale. I gave you 1 from each of the scales as an example. So the item that I want to look at has an advanced vocabulary. So when you're thinking about this, you are going to be comparing the student's vocabulary in relationship to other students who are of the same grade and the same background. So of course, an advanced vocabulary would look very different for a grade 3 student and a grade 8 student. Because this is a 0 through 4 rating and there are 10 items per scale, each scale will have the lowest score possible would be a 0 and the highest score possible would be a 40. When you get your total rating, you're going to compare that to the norms and you'll get a standard score and a percentile rank. We'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. So we can use the SIGS 2 to screen and to identify students as gifted. You see 5 bullet points on this slide, and each of these bullet points reflect a best practice. when you want to identify students as gifted. And the first one, recognizing multiple manifestations of giftedness, is, of course, that students can express their talent in many different areas. That's the nice thing, I think, about the SIGS too, is that you have domain-specific fields that you can rate: mathematics, social studies, language arts, and science. And so some students might manifest their giftedness in mathematics, others might be extremely creative, but you have that opportunity to look at the type of giftedness a student might have, because you have 7 different areas. The second bullet point, of course, is universal screening. And I understand that New Mexico does universally screen students, and I think that's awesome. You're way ahead of the curve. It, of course, just means that you're going to consider all students as potential participants. And you can do this in a couple of ways. If you're going to use the SIGS as a universal screener, you'd want to use a scale or scales that match the program that you serve your students in. Or another option is use the general intellectual ability scale, because that's a more generic scale. It looks at reasoning ability, it looks at problem solving, it looks at is a student able to be able to see multiple viewpoints. So that one would work as well, but that's up to you. Some schools decide that they want to use a instrument or a measure that everybody gets anyway, and that's definitely certainly an option. I always know, and I always like to tell people that I have taught all grade levels, from grade 3 to graduate students. I've taught high school math, I've taught middle school math, I've taught gifted programs, I taught both undergraduates and graduate students. So I know that there's also a consideration that is called time. So sometimes we want to try to be as close to best practices as we can, but we do have to take into consideration time. The third bullet point, using multiple pathways for identification. Best practices tell us that we should use both performance and non-performance measures. A performance measure lets us see what the performance of the student is. And so an example would be a mathematics achievement test, or any type of achievement test. You get a score. The student does something and you get a score. Non-performance measures, on the other hand, are more based on observations or judgments. And so for the SIGS too, which is a rating scale based on observations, it would be considered a non-performance measure. You'd want to use both types of measures in any identification system, because it makes your identification stronger, and it gives more pathways for a student to enter into the gifted program. Obviously, we want to use valid and reliable measurement tools. We want to make sure that the scores, or in this case on the SIGS-2, the ratings that we get when we use the SIGS-2 have evidence of reliability and validity. And I am going to talk about each of these concepts briefly later, but I do want to just let you know we have a very nice manual, and there's a chapter on validity and there's a chapter on reliability. So you can read all about the studies there. The last thing I want to talk about is considering using local norms. Now, can be a little tricky, but when would you use local norms? You would use local norms if your student population in your school district is very different from a nationally representative sample, because the norms that we developed for the SIGS-2 were based on a national representative sample of students kindergarten through grade 12 throughout the United States. I'm going to talk more about the normative sample, but just know that we stratified our sample on sex, on ethnicity, and on race. And we compared those, and grade level as well. We compared those to the US Census, and we have a pretty good match. So local norms, the nice thing about the SIGS 2 is we have an entire chapter in our manual, it's chapter 6, and that chapter lets you know how to choose your sample and how to calculate the norms. Now, the most important thing about if you are actually going to use local norms is you would want to make sure that your sample is representative of all the students in the district, including ability level. You don't want to just take a nominated pool of students for the gifted programs because they're going to be higher ability. So you want to make sure that that sample you choose is representative of all ability levels in your school district. So those are some ways to use the SIGS 2 to screen and identify. Now let's talk about some administration considerations. So the first thing I want to do is just read to you what the instructions for the SIGS 2 say. So if you are the coordinator of gifted education and you're asking raters to rate students, you would, let's say you're using the paper pencil version, you'd hand the paper pencil version to the ratee, or you might have a group with you, and you would say, your student has been nominated for our school's gifted and talented program. I would like to know the degree to which the student exhibits a number of characteristics in comparison to her grade level peers. Now, on the front of the paper pencil version of the SIGS 2, the 7 scales are listed, and there's a checkbox that you can check, which lets the rater know which scales to rate. You also could highlight the names of the scales. It's just a twofold sheet of paper. The scales are in the middle and on the back. The instructions are on the front. So you could just highlight. I want you to complete the language arts and the general intellectual ability and the creativity scales. The online version is really easy because you as the coordinator would assign teachers to the scales that you want them to rate. And those are the only scales that they would see. So that's really a nice feature of the online. The other thing that's important to know in terms of rater selection is that obviously for the SRS, or the school rating scale, educators would be rating. You would want to make sure those educators had time to observe the student in the classroom environment. And we highly recommend that that is a minimum of 4 weeks on a daily basis. So it'll be longer if you have students only seeing a teacher for a particular subject for 2 or 3 times a week. So, and then the other thing is that the person who most often will complete the SRS, of course, is a teacher. And you would want the teacher of the subject area to complete that subject area scale. The other 3 scales, general intellectual ability, creativity, and leadership, you would have the teacher that would be able to observe those characteristics the most complete that. And so, for example, I'm just going to let you know, you might have a program that is serves students in language arts. So you might say, okay, I'm going to give them the language arts, I'm going to do creativity, because I'm interested, maybe you have a creative writing component to the language arts, and I'm going to do general intellectual ability. You'd probably have the language arts teacher rate all of those scales, because you're looking, especially if it's has a component of creative writing in it. For the parents, we recommend that both parents complete the scale together if there are two parents. If there are not, the parent who is with the student the most often would complete it, or a guardian or guardians would complete it together. One of the things you do not want to do with the SIGS-2 is you do not want to have two parents or two raters rate a student on the same scale separately and then average those scores. That's not how the SIGS-2 was developed. It was developed so that there's not averaging. The raters should work together if you want more than one rater per scale, and they should come to consensus. Okay, deciding which scales to administer. Well, obviously you'd want to administer the scales that match your program. And so if you have, let's say you have both mathematics and language arts, you'd give the mathematics and language arts. Or if you had a STEM program, you'd probably do science and mathematics. You'd consider giving the general intellectual ability measure, depending on the programming and what you want to do with it. The nice thing about the SIGS-2 is each scale is standalone. Each scale was normed separately. There is no composite score. You never collect information on all 7 scales, add those together, and take an average. You have nothing to compare it to because there's no norm for an average of all 7 scales. So make sure that you think about the SIGS-2 as standalone scales, and I think that makes it just more flexible. It makes it so that you can choose the scales that you want to administer and the scales that best match the needs of your students and the program that you serve the students in. The next bullet, comparison to peers, is that little part in the instructions where we say, in comparison to her grade level peers. We had a focus group of teachers that we talked to, and we asked that focus group, when you think about a student and you want to compare that student's ability, do you use age or grade? And as a whole, they said grade level. So our norms are based on grade level, and they are K through 2, 3 through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12. So that comparison group is very important. And when you think about that comparison group, you not only want to think about same grade level, you also want to think about similar backgrounds. We know that students from low socioeconomic situations sometimes don't have the same opportunity to learn, sometimes, not always, just sometimes, but they can be underrepresented in gifted programs. So you want to think about the background of the student as well. And so when you're rating, you keep that target student and you keep that peer group in your mind. The nice thing also about the SIGS-2 is we built in a little wiggle room. Sometimes a parent or sometimes a teacher might just say, I just don't know how to rate this item. So if you have 1 or 2 items that an educator or a parent or guardian feel that they cannot adequately rate, you can still use the scale. What you do is you take an average of the remaining items. You're either going to have 8 or 9. If you have more than 2 missing items, then it's going to be unscorable. You take that average and you add that into the total once or twice, and then you have a new total and you can use the norm tables and you are all set. Okay, so norms. We have national norms. As I mentioned, they're based on grade level. K to 2, 3 to 5, 6 to 8, 9 to 12. As you can see, we have a huge sample. This is really a really big sample for a normative sample. We had 59,000 for the school rating scale and about 7,500 for the home rating scale. I've already talked briefly about the norms, but just so you know, we did match the US Census data on sex, ethnicity, and race. We also do compare our sample to what grade levels they are in and what regions of the United States they're in. So you have a lot of information about this normative sample. It's a really robust normative sample. It contains all ability levels, and it's just a really nice normative sample. I think that's a real strength of the SIGS too. Oh, let me go back to that norms. Whoops, I went too far. Okay, guys, we're just going to have to continue. Oh no, this is how I do it. Let me go back to that normative sample. One of the things about the norms, when you think about norms, obviously what they do is, let's first talk about the norms for the SIGS-2. So as we mentioned, it's a nationally representative sample. We have really big sample sizes. So you rate a student. And then what you do is you say, okay, I have this rating, and let's say it's a 32 out of 40. I'm going to see where other students in this nationally representative sample, where does my 32 fall in comparison to the students in that sample. And you can get a percentile rank and a standard score. So for example, let's say that that student falls at the 87th percentile rank. That simply means that that student was rated higher than 87% of the students in that nationally representative sample of the SIGS-2. If you have a local norm, then you're comparing that student to students in that local sample. So whatever the sample you use, that's the comparison you're making. Okay, reliability is information about how stable or how consistently does this score, how consistent is this score measure whatever it is measuring. It doesn't give us information about what it's measuring, but it gives us information about the stability and the consistency with which it measures. You step on a scale, you get a number. What does that number mean? We don't know, but it's a number. If I get off the scale and I step on it again, is it close to what I just got? If it isn't, it's going to mean that it's not consistent and it's fluctuating widely, and you probably want to throw that scale away. So the same concept goes for reliability for any measurement instrument that you use. We report 3 types of reliability in the SIGS-2: internal consistency, test, retest, and inter-rater. I'm not going to go into great detail about these. Internal consistency, though, is just a measure of how well each item on a particular scale, remember there's 10 of them, how stably do they measure the same thing, whatever that is. Those coefficients will range from 0 to 1. 0.7 is fair, 0.8 is good, and 0.9 and above is excellent. Our internal consistency coefficients are, for the most part, 0.8 or above. Test retest reliability just says, hey, I'm going to rate a student. 2 weeks later, I'm going to rate the same student on the same scale. How well do they relate to each other? How highly are they correlated? And we did several studies of test retest, and we used a 2-week period of time between the first rating and the second rating. Typically, you'll find the time period elapsed is 2 to 4 weeks. And then inter-rater reliability in this case is educator ratings to parent guardian ratings, or SRS to HRS, of the same scale for the same student. And we look at the correlations. What we find in the literature is typically those inter-rater correlations are moderate. And we did several studies of inter-rater reliability. Most of the correlations were moderate to high. We had a few low ones, but overall they were what we expected, and they matched what you expect in what you see in the literature. Okay, validity, again, I'm not going to go on and on about this, but we do have lots of studies that look at evidence of validity that the scores produced actually measure what they're supposed to measure. So before reliability, we were talking about, are they consistent? Are they stable? Whatever they're measuring. Here we're talking about, well, what are they measuring, and what evidence do you have that the scores produced by this rating actually measures the construct you say it measures? And these constructs, of course, relate to the 7 scales. General intellectual ability is the construct, or science is the construct, or creativity is the construct. So the first one is construct validity, and it's exactly what I just said. How well do the items or the scores produced by this instrument measure the construct we say? And we have several studies that show evidence that it's pretty high. Convergent validity just is simply if I give a student a rating, let's say on mathematics, and then I give the same student a mathematics achievement test, and then I correlate those 2 scores, they should be somewhat related because they're measuring mathematic strength. And so that would be evidence of convergent validity. Discriminant is the complete opposite, a lack or an absence of a relationship between a measure that measures one construct and a measure that measures a completely different construct. We have several studies that discuss that. And the last thing I'm going to go over is fairness of the SIGS-2. This is pretty important to the testing world, and it's important to me. There are standards for fairness that now were developed by 3 organizations: the American Educational Research Association, the American Psychological Association, and the National Council of Measurements in Education. And those standards are standards for testing, for educational and psychological testing. And part of those standards is a whole chapter on fairness. And the fairness, what we did in our manual, we have a whole chapter on this, and I'm not going to go into great detail on this again, but you can read about it if you're interested. But we divided those standards into 4 areas, 4 general areas. And the first 3, we use statistical studies to measure. But the last one is really something that you as a user need to use, and that is inappropriate score interpretation for intended uses. What does that mean? What that means is there are very particular instructions that we give you for using the SIGS-2. I've talked about several of those. One of those is don't average scores. Another is there's no composite score. Use the scales as standalone. If you instead average scores, then that would be inappropriate. And you're not using that score, and you're not interpreting it for the intended use of the rating scale. So you really need to think about what it is that you're trying to do, what you want to use it for, what information you want from it, and make sure you adhere to the instructions of the scale. All right, and there's, as I said, there's a whole chapter in the SIGS-2, Chapter 5, Fairness of the SIGS-2.
Thank you, Gail. Thank you for that great presentation. It's really informative. I wanted to say that we are going to have a brief Q&A at the end very shortly. We did just want to go ahead and highlight some of the titles that are new and notable that we're most excited about from Proofrock Press. And if anybody has any questions, or if Rebecca wants to maybe talk about a particular book that is on her radar right now as the editor, that this is a great time to do that. Please keep putting those questions in the chat, in that question section. It's to the right of your screen, and we're going to get to as many of those as we can.
First question from the audience.
Both the GRS and SIGS is used by a lot of our districts and schools in New Mexico. What are the most significant differences between? Good question.
Yes, it is. And I will say that I don't know tons about the GRS, but I think one of the biggest differences is that I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the GRS looks at a generic academic achievement scale, and we have specific domain scales in 4 areas. So I think that's a real good difference. I don't know if the GRS has an online version. That might be different. Do you happen to know that, Sarah?
I don't happen to know that.
Okay, so those are probably the biggest differences. I would also, I mean, I'm not being modest here. I also would probably think that our normative sample is quite a bit larger. It's a really big normative sample. You don't typically find that with a national standardized test, because it's, takes a lot of time to collect that type of data.
Excellent. Thank you, Gail. And then there is another question. Do you find that SIGS works better with COGAT or NNAT3?
That's the COGAT, the Cognitive Abilities Test, and the Naglieri, I believe, Nonverbal Intelligence Test. Yes, I think that it goes really well, especially with the COGAT. We've done the author of the COGAT and I have done presentations at NAGC, the National Association of Gifted Children, and we've talked about how they kind of go hand in hand. You've got a measure of ability, it's a performance measure, and then you have that together with a non-performance measure or rating, where you have information based on observations in the classroom or in the home environment, and it does blend well. The Naglieri, I think, is a great test as well. I've used it before, and we do have some studies in our validity chapter with correlations between the COGAT and the SIGS too. I believe we might have it with the NAT too. We have a lot of studies, so that will give you some more information of how well they relate.
Let's see, there's another question for you, Gail. What would you say to a teacher who wants to rate all students as average or below average in spite of having many gifted students in the room?
Right. Well, they're supposed to compare them to their grade level peers. And so how could all students that you're rating be at the same level or below level? That would be very unusual. I think that because the items on the 6-2R reflect strengths of the students, I mean, things like an advanced vocabulary, you should, as a teacher, be able to observe a student using an advanced vocabulary in comparison to the same grade. So I think that they would need to really consider that they are comparing and how much more. Ours is not, the other thing is ours does not use words like average, it uses words like, does this student have an advanced vocabulary the same as grade level peers, or somewhat more than grade level peers, or much more than grade level peers? I think that helps make the comparison easier and maybe helps a teacher realize that you have a continuum in every classroom.
Can you explain the summary form?
Yeah, the summary form, it's simply, let me see if I even have one. I haven't looked at this summary form in a while, but it, I believe, yeah, there it is. It's, I can even hold it up. Ta-da! So on the front of the summary form, you have the demographics of the student, and then you have the name of the rater, the date of the rating, and then you do have a summary of scores. And so in that summary of scores, you would have the raw score. Remember when I said that the total score for each scale would go from 0 to 40? So the raw score that would go in that box would be the total score that you get once you sum all the items on the test. You certainly might, you probably wouldn't have all 7 scales filled out, because you probably would only maybe giving 3 or 4 scales for your school. But some people do use all 7 scales, and that's fine as well. The second box is the standard score. You would get the standard score by simply going to the back of the manual, finding the table that matches the grade level of your student, finding that raw score, and just tracking over to the standard score. The standard scores that we use for the SIGS 2 have a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. So that means if the student is at the average, they're going to have 100. If the student is 115, that means that they're 1 standard deviation above the mean. If they have 130, it's 2 standard deviations above the mean. We do have guidelines for interpreting standard scores. So basically, if you have a student who's scoring 130 or higher, then the likelihood that they're gifted and or have talent in that area is pretty high. And so those guidelines are in the manual. You also get percentile ranks. Again, you would just go to your standard score to percentile ranks table. Let's see. And then on the back of the form is a place to put that information in again. And then also you can put other measures in and those scores. You can add qualitative data from the SIGS 2. One of the things that I forgot to say is if a teacher or a parent scores or rates a student with 5 or more 4s, that's the top score on a scale, we highly recommend that they provide examples. And those examples could go into the qualitative data information.
We've got a couple of more questions here.
Okay.
How does SIGS work for potentially 2E students? Is there anything that we need to potentially look at?
What was that? For what kind of students?
Twice exceptional, I believe.
Oh, twice exceptional.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yes. Yes. That is a great question. I love that question. Yeah, you have to take that into consideration because we find that those students also are quite often only identified as having a need instead of having strength. And so again, these are strengths. When you are rating a student, you not only have to take into consideration their peer, but you also want to take into consideration their if they're a second language student or if they have a disability, and then how do they show their strength if they also have a disability. So yes, take that into consideration and always think strengths, and I like that question a lot. Thank you.
can the SIGS be used effectively with Indigenous students?
Yes, because again, it's based on strengths. And again, you've got a target student that you're comparing to your comparison group. Your comparison group are grade level peers from the same background. So you have to remember that, because that's the important thing. You're not comparing those students to students who might be in other environments or have other backgrounds. One more thing about that last question. I would suggest that you might use local norms with your Indigenous populations, because they would differ from the national representative sample that we've normed the SIGS 2 on. So that would be and because we have very clear instructions in the manual, hopefully if you have a data person in your school district, they would be able to help you with that. Okay.
That's great. Thank you, Gail. I've enjoyed listening to your presentation. It's always great to hear directly from the creator, the originator.
And to all the gifted LEA leaders and district administrators from across the state attending our webinar, we hope you enjoyed this customized Q&A session with the author all about the easy, effective way to identify gifted students with behavior rating scales using SIGS 2. And to the listeners of this recording, if you are part of a school district or professional learning community and you're interested in setting up something similar like what you've seen today, such as a book study or another type of custom session, please do get in touch with us to discuss your content area needs, and we'll be able to figure out what type of a session will work best for your group.